Hello, as you probably saw if you are here, Apple Plus is aiming to bring new audiences to Edith Wharton through their new series, The Buccaneers, which is taking her last unfinished novel for the screen. And having finally taken the book off of my TBR by reading it, I want to discuss the show in conversation with the book today. And I talk about the book in a dedicated fashion on a recent live that I will link here if you want to talk about the book exclusively, because my approach was reading the book, talking about the book, and then moving into the television show. And I acknowledged even in that discussion of the book that there were going to be changes that were made to the show, not only with the stylistic world it seemed to be living in based on the trailer with Olivia Rodrigo pumping in the background, but just in terms of the structure of the book, because the book is 4 very distinct parts, and these 4 parts are incredibly episodic, and they jump around in terms of the time of these young women's lives, and I anticipated that the show would really streamline the action into one kind of moment to up the stakes and the buy-in and the drama of it, which absolutely happened. What I found interesting is that 1, the show is clearly setting up a desired second season, but 2, it really seems to focus very loosely on the first 2 books of the novel. And I say loosely because so much is changed that it's hard to kind of transpose the original structure on what this ended up being. And I don't say that as a judgment in and of itself, because clearly changes needed to happen. And in some ways, I found myself responding to this similarly to how I responded to the translation of The Essex Serpent to the screen last year, also by Apple Plus, in that here it felt like a lot of the searing social commentary we get from Wharton out of deft and subtle character study was sacrificed for broad dramatic twists. So while I really appreciate some of the changes and appreciate why they had to happen, others feel broad and sweeping and like they don't trust us as audience members, going back to my critique of The Essex Serpent, where it felt like it didn't trust us to kind of draw the lines ourselves, and it made things a little too obvious. And from the start of this series, it felt like it didn't necessarily trust us from starting us with a voiceover, which, you know, if you've been here for a second, I don't love if it's not integrated and purposeful. And here we get a voice introduction from Nan that tells us point blank, if a story isn't a love story, it's a tragedy, and seems to be complicating that idea and indicating that her story is going to be more complex. Now, Wharton readers know that her stories usually are tragedies. In a Vanity Fair article I will link below, the showrunner, Catherine Jakeways, talks about how she hopes or she doesn't want to have done or do anything that Edith Wharton would disapprove of. And also this article talks about how this show is taking the original text versus the text that was completed in the 90s by Marion Mainwaring, which is the text that I read. Now, this text was finished based on Wharton's notes and what she had outlined for the end, but is notably different from Wharton's language in some ways that was called out by different reviews. Now, this is interesting because 1, the show deviates so much from the text. I find it interesting that that distinction is being made at all dramaturgically, and I almost wonder if it is a justification for how much they have changed and how that will change the ending, which is, at least from what I have read, Wharton's most optimistic ending. So while it isn't a love story or a tragedy, Wharton is always much more complicated. And this works to explore similar things, absolutely, while also recognizing how modern this novel really feels, because while there is a lot of critique that could be made about how this was kind of made for modern audiences, the concept of the show was for a modern audience and almost feels like something that you would see on the CW in some ways. At the same time, while I was reading the book, I had the same thoughts as the showrunner, where I was like, this feels very modern. You have these girls running through hallways and giggling and playing pranks and getting into mischief, and it just feels modern. And part of that is the language Wharton was using. And I absolutely also agree that a lot of the characters in the book are almost kind of sketches of people. Nan gets the character development, and a lot of the other girls in the group don't. They are kind of in the background. They have these storylines that interweave with Nan's, but they're not fully fledged. And so I really enjoy that the show gives them all their due. Their plot lines land with varying degrees of success for me, and I do feel like the show is aiming to explore in similar ways what women's fates were at the time, where and how they're allowed to claim power, and the kind of stifling nature of society. At the same time, I do think, one, that it doesn't work, like I said, in the same subtleties that Wharton does. There is a real kind of undercurrent, like a biting undercurrent to Wharton's words that feel a lot more surface level and obvious here from, you know, the first episode where there's the line about "will always come first," and it just doesn't feel, the dialogue doesn't feel as nuanced as I would want from a Wharton. And so I don't mind that the tone doesn't feel like traditional period piece. In fact, I like that the show kind of reflects this kind of franticness from the book in its camera movements, which in the first episode did make me a little queasy, but at the same time I appreciated that. But also these changes, which we will discuss, don't worry, somehow also inadvertently, I believe, end up defining these young women by their traumas rather than their actions. And I'm not taking away from the power they reclaim out of this trauma, but it is much more broadly shown here than the kind of subtleness of the novel where it's this kind of slow sucking of the spirit for these young women and how they change in this society and how society forces them to change. And I'm not denying that a lot of this did happen at the time that the show is reflecting. And again, there are differing plot lines here that I enjoy more than the other in terms of the additions, but that is how the kind of compound effect of these changes read generally to me at the end of the day. So with that being said, what were these changes? And again, I am not being like a text purist here. I am not going through this just to be like, well, they changed this. Because again, I acknowledge that changes had to happen. And some of the changes were interesting, some of them, but it's about making changes that fit within the spirit of the original text and how that works. And again, you can make really big kind of structural changes and still honor the spirit of the original. But here it feels like we were kind of taking what we wanted from the original to tell the story we actually wanted to tell, which is neither here nor there. That's just how it felt. And so from the beginning, the changes were evident from where we started, because we start the show at Conchita's wedding and we start the book at Saratoga for the summer. And this idea of what this smaller speck of society looks like, how these girls start as girls, we see the kind of playfulness of them from meeting Miss Testvalley at the train station. And we'll get into all of that character and those changes, because that is one of my least favorite things about the show, I'm not gonna lie. Starting at the wedding in the show kind of makes sense. It's a more active start. It gives a reason for these girls to go over to England outside of the time jumps of the novel. It makes things a lot more active, but it is undeniably a very big change to the text, starting with how Conchita and Lord Richard's relationship functions throughout the course of the show. Because in the book, he's kind of a non-entity after he has wooed her over this summer. And we get the sense from that summer that he is a little bit of a cad and that he is chasing her for her money. And there is this sense of impropriety from him in the past, and that he has been cast out from his family for some indiscretion and what that is. Additionally, while in the book she is pregnant at her wedding, this isn't acknowledged, at least that I caught, until much later in the book, where it's this kind of distant memory where even the girls have kind of rewritten it in their own minds, and it acknowledges that rewriting in their own minds. And so here it is a much more dire kind of circumstance, and we feel that urgency. But then it's setting up this relationship that's a little bit different between Conchita and Lord Richard. The spirit of her conflict when she moves over to England with the Brittleseys and being accepted. Again, I may mispronounce things as we go about. I apologize. I'm trying to remember those pronunciations. And we even had a helpful carriage scene in the first episode all about trying to teach us those pronunciations, but nevertheless. So this whole family structure from Lord Richard as well. In the book, I believe he was the younger son, if I had things kind of tracked out correctly, because that's why he could be kind of shipped off. He was not the heir. And so in the book, Jinny marries the heir. We'll get to him, don't worry, though I don't want to, we will. So the whole dynamic of this relationship is different in that in the book, Richard is absent. Conchita is carrying on kind of having these lavish gatherings and kind of being loud and boisterous, having these very thinly veiled affairs, and just the way that she moves about. And they are always kind of burdened by this idea of debt, which has been set up in the series with Conchita's father losing all of his money, which is framed as this idea that now they can no longer escape the confines of this family, but it also is potentially setting up something very important if we do get a season 2 in relation to Nan and borrowing money from Nan, and presumably if it continues to follow the book, which Nan is so different. Nan's going to be last. But that's also different that maybe they'll keep it, maybe they won't. At this point, I have no real way to know what they are setting up that still exists within the original text, or if we've taken our inspiration from the original text as far as we're going to at this point. And so this relationship is just much different. Also, they cut her brother Teddy, who was always around like with a guitar in the book. I thought for a second that the other guy in the group, whose name I can't even remember, the doctor who Mabel was going to marry for a hot second. We'll talk about Mabel. She's my favorite changes. But I thought for a second he was Teddy. He was not Teddy. But there is still this sense of this world kind of breaking Conchita's spirit at the beginning, and we see in the book how she starts to defy that, and I think this season is showing her starting to defy that and kind of living loudly. Where I think that this season makes it a little bit more dynamic is that it sets up this kind of rivalry in some ways with Jinny in relation to how the Brittlesey family views Conchita versus Jinny, and it does directly address the racism and colorism at play here when Conchita confronts Lady Brittlesey, but it also surprisingly potentially does somewhat address this in the book, not in the same way there, and I can't comment on how well the idea of racism is handled in the book, but it is acknowledged in a way that I didn't expect to see it acknowledged, and so that in the show is not as big a change as you might think, but rather the real big change with Conchita is just her relationship with Teddy and the kind of real spiral of that relationship, and it kind of plays with the idea of her selfishness, but not as much as in the book. Now granted, in the book we really are seeing things from Nan's point of view, and here Nan changes so dramatically that they all kind of have their foibles for sure, which is part of the charm of the book as well, this idea that these women all have their foibles. Also in the book, the two families did not go over to England together. The St. Georges were there ahead of time because Miss Testvalley had really angled to get them over there, and then the Elmsworths come over later and they actually see Jinny and Nan in this promenade on the street and are jealous, and so the families end up hooking up that way, but they don't initially go over together. So there's already this greater camaraderie in the show than in the book. In the book, it's almost mutual alliances and these old friends based on them being the people you've known forever. So also with Miss Testvalley, which I will probably attack fully with Nan, maybe, but I don't know. In the book, there is an acknowledged prior affair between her and Lord Richard. But in the show, it is almost tinged as like this weird Venus in furs kind of thing. And part of the problem here is that the show talks about how none of the children in the Brittlesey family come out unscarred, but they're never really making clear what the dynamic of the household is here. For the end of the season, it's kind of hinted that it's just this incredible silence and remoteness from the parents, but the whole tenor of the season felt like it was building up to some greater revelation there, and also with the additional kind of trauma that we've added and sprinkled throughout the rest of the series, I wouldn't have been surprised for some bigger revelation there. And so I really struggled with that because in the book, I loved Miss Testvalley so much, and here in the show we really are focusing on these young women, and it feels like we have taken away a lot of the women that are kind of the reflection of potential futures in some way, and we've almost sacrificed Miss Testvalley, who I would argue is the second most important woman in the novel after Nan, to Mrs. St. George's development, and how she is just a vastly different character in this show than she is in the book. And in some ways ways I understand, but at the same time, she is a much nicer, a lot less calculating. There is a sharpness to which she is drawn by Wharton that is really kind of smoothed out here. And so moving overseas in a way that makes sense, Conchita is how these girls get overseas. And when continuing to look at these changes, and I promise I'm not going to dwell in every little beat change, let's look at Mabel, because her changes don't as directly kind of tie in with the changes of the other girls, and her changes are the storyline I like the most of the changes in the show, because she is given a lesbian romance with the Brittlesea daughter, and this is really beautiful. I don't always love Mabel's characterization in terms of the tone of her voice, and I'm fighting that vocal fry and giving into that vocal fry myself. I've never taken kind of like voice lessons in acting or in a way that I'm aware as much of my voice. I've been in an acting class where I was aware that I was pitching my voice up a lot when I was younger, and so I really tried to stay in a more natural tone, and because of that I find myself slipping into something that would be considered more vocal fry in the current moment, but it was something I was very aware of in the tonality. And I don't know about the dialect work in this because it was very loosey-goosey, and that could be a decision for the modernization of the piece to make it feel more immediate to modern viewers, especially young modern viewers, that the show really seems to be aiming itself at or for, but it also didn't feel cohesive in its dialect work, or that those choices were forwarding something larger in the story. It didn't feel like those were very specific choices that were made, I should say, and that's all I'm going to say about it, because I don't want it to read like a critique of the actress, because I really enjoyed this plot line. I thought it was really lovely. This is the kind of modernization in novels like this that I think audiences really are really wanting, and it provides a lot more of a dynamic range for Mabel, because in the book she just kind of disappears, married off to this rich man in Illinois. It will be interesting to see if we follow that initial timeline and if that ends up happening. Like, how much tragedy are we going to infuse into this? Because it really feels like when they think Wharton, they think tragedy, which fair. I also thought tragedy, at least until recently when I read the Buccaneers, when thinking of Wharton. But when adding this plot line in, which has already been kind of complicated throughout season 1, there was a very clear arc here. We have a happy ending of sorts for them currently, at least as happy as this world is allowing. And it feels like we've earned that, especially in relation to everyone else. I don't want to see these women taken down, especially because Honoria—
it's Honoria, and I've really earned this silly frame here—
has grown up in this really tumultuous household. We're seeing her really come into her own for the first time. She was just like a casual mention in the book, and she is probably one of my favorite things in the show. So I really enjoyed that addition in terms of plot changes. And because Mabel was so minor in the book, it also didn't feel like it was that big a change. And because the book itself acknowledges so many things that feel very modern in its blunt acknowledgement in many ways, including like Conchita's affairs, there is an honesty and a frankness there that I personally wasn't expecting. And so this doesn't feel as out of place. And as the show seems to want to explore women reclaiming and telling their stories and saying the things that are often unsaid, this is a reality that often went unsaid, and I really enjoyed seeing it. And it was a little bit of romance for a season that really didn't have any. If I was supposed to be invested in the Nan romance and like love triangle that they set up there, spoiler alert, I was not. So moving on to the other Elmsworth sister, we have Lizzy, who is also a little bit more fleshed out here. Now in the book, Lizzy and Jinny are both angling for Lord Brittlesea at the cabin at Runnymede, which they have rented for the summer, but it is a much different dynamic because that character is completely different. In the book, he is almost just kind of the prize that has been won. He has a mistress at the beginning, which is only important because it forces the hand at the cabin, because turns out his mistress is who they have been renting this cabin from. And originally the deal when Miss Testvalley acquired the cabin was that he was not to come over when they were there, and he did anyway. And so she comes down to kind of see what's going on, and because he had missed a lunch, and it kind of forces this rivalry between Lizzy and Jinny to a head, and basically he chooses Jinny, and Lizzy supports that in the moment because they kind of close ranks against this outsider who has come in, and they are kind of summering there similarly to the kind of recklessness, and that's maybe not the right word or the best word that we see in the show, this sense that there are no rules while they're in this place, and how that kind of really fundamentally changes the dynamic, but also just this idea at the time in the book that we are kind of contrasting this really staid society, and here we have this place outside of things that is just kind of a free-for-all, and that is part of the appeal. It talks about it in the show as well, this idea that these Americans have come in and the rules have suddenly changed, and suddenly these men are liking this frankness, but it's also this idea that it is something different and novel to a lot of these people, and where we see in Brittlesea, and I forget his name, his first name in the show, I'm not gonna lie to you, Jenny's husband, it is James. James is almost this kind of prize to be won, and he's really in the background for a lot of this. Obviously, this is very different in the show from the moment we are in this cabin, especially where we've seen him kind of making eyes at Jinny previously, and then Jinny is a little too forward at this cabin in these circumstances, and he is playing this power trip, right? He's seeing how much he can push her. But in the process, they mirror this rivalry between Lizzy and Jinny, and he starts to give attention to Lizzy that makes the girls think he has switched focus, which kind of forwards this rivalry, and is also pitting the girls against each other purposefully because it's part of Jenny's isolation that we see him maneuvering. And so he is basically testing Lizzy, and in this test, they go off to a bedroom together, which in and of itself is scandalous, and he asks her to undress, and she does. And she is naked on a bed, and he just leaves and ultimately just sends word much, much later as she has been laying there alone and naked that he's not coming back. And so it is the ultimate kind of embarrassment. It's meant to make her feel powerless, and this is reflected in Lizzy the rest of the season. And so we see her utterly shaken by this because it is an abusive action, and it does give us as viewers that hint that something even worse is coming with Jinny, and we will talk about that. It definitely amped up the anxiousness for me in the viewing of the season, and while I didn't love that in Lizzy, it did kind of give her more of a dynamic, and I didn't love seeing that growth really framed by this abuse and by this trauma, but at the same time, it was giving voice to something that to many girls today could feel incredibly relatable, and it also played with this idea of shame for her, that she believed she had acted in a way that was shameful, that she was embarrassed, and that she was then giving this man power over her because he had claimed that from her. That was his goal, and so he succeeded. So she goes back off to America. She runs away. She is utterly devastated by this. And so then the rest of the season is not only her coming back, but also her grappling with this because he still is trying to get that power over her, not only for the sake of the satisfaction for him of having that power over her, but also because it further isolates Jinny. And so instead the dynamic is Lizzy really coming into her own and facing off against him more directly in relation especially to Jinny, because she knows there is something dangerous in him and she is worried about her friend. Now, where this could be setting things up for Lizzy's story in the rest of the book is still unclear, because she does end up marrying a politician in the book, and they both kind of scheme, and he is impressed by her scheming, and so this may be the start of that kind of brain in her, that scheming, but it's unclear where that is ultimately going to lead if there is a season 2 within the course of the show. Now, that being said, I think for the season that we have, and if the show just stands on its own here, I think we have a very neat, clear arc from her. Do I always love sitting in that arc? No, but I do think that it is a clear kind of progression for her and that she has a full, complete story. Now, this brings us to Jinny, and I don't want to completely define her story by an abusive relationship that becomes her story at the end. But in the book, Jinny is also a little bit more of a sketch of a character than we see here, and it is easy to feel like Jinny is overshadowed by this horrific plot line that becomes her reality at the end of the show. But I think there are also some really interesting changes that they make to her in terms of seeing her grapple with a little bit more. Now, I don't always like her. For much of the series, I probably don't like her, but I think what they're doing is really interesting because in the book, it's kind of the thing that she's the beautiful sister, but that there's not a whole lot going on upstairs necessarily. And in the show, we see that reflected, but we see her be insecure about that, this idea that she is only seen for her beauty and she wants to be seen so clearly, and she knows that she can't stand against her sister in matters of wit, but still wants to be recognized for herself. That kind of plays into a change with Nan that drives me up a wall, but we'll get there, don't worry. And so we do see a little bit more awareness and insight from her, especially in the line where she says, "And someday I'll be the used to be beautiful one." She recognizes that her appeal is kind of fleeting and she feels inferior to her sister in a lot of ways. And she has this rivalry with her sister, at least in her own mind, in feeling inferior. And that spurs a lot of the choices that she has made in terms of revealing Nan's secret and how that is kind of the catalyst for everything else in the season and ultimately some of her own downfall in some ways. I will say, in a kind of break in talking about the script choices, I did have a moment where I was like, why does Jenny's mouth look so familiar? Or just the way the actress kind of acted with her mouth. And I found out that the actress was Imogen Waterhouse, who is the sister of Sookie Waterhouse, who was in Daisy Jones and the Six. And that made it interesting simply because, to me, and that's like very much what I know of these actresses, I know they are much bigger and have other projects, but this is what I know. I'm a book nerd. And so I found it interesting the way that their characters' plot lines, especially in terms of pregnancy that is more complicated, kind of reflect each other. So I'm not trying to play into any other potential sibling rivalries with that comment. I just found that parallel really interesting. But here, Jinny definitely has much more of a role, and it is really a struggle for me sometimes because I was so interested in the way that character was being fleshed out, but I struggled so much with the abuse storyline. And I again recognize that this was a reality for so many women, and I don't even think it's outside of the realm for Wharton, but it felt like such a deviation in some ways because while it did aim to kind of explore a much more subtle abuse, for most of that show it really is these power plays, the really insidious, underhanded, kind of lingering threat, the subtleness that makes you question your own mind, the way that he was isolating Jinny from her friends and family. And so it did try to fit in to how I think Wharton would have played with that. But at the same time, I felt like Wharton was really exploring, at least in this novel, how the everyday can break your spirit in some ways. And I don't know that this was ultimately where I really wanted to see this going, but it then combines with a lot of these other storylines, including Nan's. Nan. Okay, Nan is very not like other girls here. She could be argued in the book to be that way, but in the book she's very romantic and idealistic. And I say romantic in the sense of she is enamored of places and things and the histories of things, and she sees these like elegant kind of outlooks and storylines to things. And she is very young for most of the book. She is much younger than everyone else. And so in the book, some of these romantic complications and entanglements she finds herself in are related to how she views the world and how that is tempered over the course of the novel by reality rather than some dramatic twist in her history. And so we're going to talk about the idea that in the show, Nan is illegitimate and that her mother is not Mrs. St. George, because I thought it was a completely asinine change. I absolutely hated it. I don't understand why it was necessary, because basically now we're framing Nan's entire story around this grand reveal rather than this idea that Nan doesn't really belong. She doesn't fit. And so it's the showy external driver of the thing rather than this more insidious, slow-growing, internal character-driven thing. It does provide a more tangible illustration of this kind of tension between her and Jinny. It gives her something to grapple with, but I think that there were better ways to do that, especially because they cut Miss Testvalley back so much, because Miss Testvalley really was Nan's confidant and her mother in some ways. I swear, if they make Miss Testvalley her mother, I don't know what I'm gonna do. I don't see that happening because I don't remember if her and the Colonel were ever in a room together, and logistically it doesn't make sense, but we've changed so much else. I surely don't know, but it also gives this reason for her not to be accepted in a way that is more than just she's an American, and I don't know that it has to be that complicated. I did like the kind of tenor of the ballrooms and this kind of juxtaposition shown between, especially when the Colonel was in the scene with this kind of loud, obnoxious laugh, and how that played against a room in England. And there was always this sense of dread in these rooms. There was this building anxiety, but we ended up taking these kind of broad strokes, as I mentioned, and I think that in Nan's storyline, it is as evident as anywhere, especially because we are really consolidating her romantic complications in a way that make it a love triangle. And so we start the show kind of setting up this love story versus tragedy thing in a way that makes it all feel incredibly melodramatic, especially because the characters, especially of Tintagel, are changed so dramatically. So we meet Guy over in America, which is the first big change, and so there is this immediate attraction between him and Nan that is very heavy-handed. But the whole point in the book is that they are kind of kindred spirits that see each other in a way that those around them maybe don't, but there's no real sense at the beginning of the book that they have any ideas or hopes there. He also has a kind of destitute estate in the book, but his plan has always been to kind of go off to Brazil and make a fortune. So we seem to be following that plot line at the end of the season, but we've gotten there in a much more melodramatic kind of way because we've set up Guy and the Duke as best friends. In the book, they are more aware of each other. Guy is involved in politics at the Duke's behest, but we never get the sense that that is anything but a working relationship because, as the book specifically says, the Duke is full of scruples. I think the most telling, or one of the most telling early changes for the Duke himself is that he is a painter rather than obsessed with clocks, because in the book, he is very concerned with this idea of order. The idea that the book Duke would find out that Nan was illegitimate and still declare himself for her is completely out of the picture. He is still interested in someone that wants him for more than his title, but it is not this romantic, almost ideal that it's presented in the show. It's really this more kind of whim, and it is, again, a little bit more nuanced, well, a lot more nuanced through the Wharton lens. So we've taken a lot of Nan's development and backstory from seeing her as a young girl, watching her become enamored of her governess that she initially really pushed back against, and how she becomes a confidant to her, how she becomes enamored of this poetry and really kind of digs in to, again, these capital R romantic ideals, especially in her love of medieval poetry, and the way that that kind of worldview pushes her to sacrifices later in the novel. Now we still see her sacrifice in the show. We see her sacrifice herself for her sister, and so we have a much more dynamic, involved relationship there, a much more complicated relationship there, but we also in some ways see a much more selfish Nan when she isn't able to see what is going on with those around her. Now in the book, I would argue that Conchita is presented as more selfish, but here there really is that push and pull. I do like that we have more natural development between Conchita and Nan's relationship, their friendship there. Now in the book, they are friends. Nan is especially taken with Conchita. The first summer Conchita is at Saratoga, the summer everything changes in the way that younger girls look up to these more worldly, experienced, cooler, older girls. At least that's what it feels like Conchita is to Nan, especially because she is the new person in this world and she is more boisterous boisterous and lively, and that is something as well. We have this real liveliness with the girls, but in the book we kind of see the way they're shaken out, a kind of like the staid perfection or attempts at perfection that their mothers are instilling in them, and we get to see a little bit more of that juxtaposition. In the show, it's kind of frenzied from the start, and then we have that like fourth wall breaking kind of descent down the stairs where they don't even trust us to learn the names of the main characters without the Canva font. And believe me, I can't say anything against the Canva font. I'm probably using the Canva font in this video. However, it felt a little bit much as a viewer in the first episode. So getting back to the point, Nan's relationships with Guy and I guess Theo, which is not his name in the book, at least that I remember, feel much more kind of teen drama in that it really is setting up this kind of tawdry love triangle, and I don't know exactly how I feel about it because in the book these are much separate problems for Nan and they coincide in her mind, but there is this struggle that is unburdened of this crossover, and so she's able even then to kind of view it in a much more romanticized way. And she's looking at Guy later down the line as they become closer after she has been married and looking at things with a new set of eyes. I will also say the whole point in the book is that there hasn't been impropriety between Nan and Guy, at least in the most traditional sense as it has been raised, and something very tragic has happened to her at the outset of book 3 in the novel, which we have not gotten to, and we will see then, I guess, if that carries over into the show. The plot lines they've been adding, I would guess yes, we are going to see that in the show, and we are going to get even darker in season 2 than we've been in season 1. And I think something that plays into the way these plot lines are reading to me as a viewer, how they feel a little heavy-handed, how they feel almost tawdry in some ways, and that it's cheapening this trauma that these girls are experiencing. And again, I don't want to take away from those experiences, but the fact that we're seeing everything through a little bit more of a frenzied lens, which builds that anxiety, and then we're seeing this much more heavy subject matter, everything is kind of building this anxiety. And even these moments that are supposed to provide levity or show the closeness of these young women feels like it is still burdened by this. And so in the same way with something like, you know, Macbeth, which is unquestionably a tragedy, we have things like the Porter scene. Yes. Am I referencing back to something we talked about in my senior English class? Yes, but you know, if it works, it works. And we have these moments of brevity and lightness that it feels like this show doesn't give us the true brevity and lightness. It doesn't give us these moments. There are glimpses where it's trying to do this, like when Lizzy and Jinny sneak away from the hedge maze and are on the lake, where they're kind of laughing and rediscovering their relationship as friends and feeling lighter and unburdened for the first time in a while. So I do think that there were definite efforts at this. And also that shot, that whole episode was gorgeous in its shots, and the show undoubtedly has some beautifully gorgeous shots. And also actually maybe some of these design choices are also playing into this tension and the way this is building for me. It uses modern music, which I don't question on its face. Some choices in its music worked much better for me than others. Some of it just felt kind of like slapped on the scene to me, I'm not gonna lie. And actually in this season, Taylor Swift herself has both instances of really worked for me in the scene, and I didn't understand why it was there. And so the use of Nothing New at the presentation ball I thought worked incredibly well. The use of Long Live at the end, not so much. The fact that they never used Red Wine Supernova by Chapel Rowan for Mabel, really a tragedy. So all of this was building this focus and these stakes, and it's kind of robbing some of the humor that we see even in the book as things feel incredibly burdened in a lot of ways. We also get these glimpses of humor, specifically in how we are looking at some characters so straight on. And this goes back to how this show is currently kind of robbing us of the representation of these young women's futures in the women that are explored in society already. We've seen the expansion, like I said, of Mrs. St. George and exploring this idea that this like picture perfect thing, she's achieved what she has set out to, but there is this deep unhappiness in her relationship. But we don't have, like I said, Miss Testvalley fully explored, and ultimately at this point her character has potentially been tainted so much by this really unexplored storyline between her and Lord Richard, where in the book it feels like this is a very old thing that has gone unsaid. I got the sense that he was the more predatory of the two and that she has kind of let this dull in her memory. But again, I did have trouble kind of pinning down the ages in the book when I was reading it, so maybe I grossly misinterpreted, but it's a very different tenor in the show to my kind of viewing, and I don't know how we pull back from that and how we've kind of amped that up at the end of the season with Richard. So we're ultimately sacrificing one of the most dynamic women in the novel to further a man who is a second thought in the book's storyline, and also the fact that Miss Testvalley isn't a society, so we're seeing this variety of experience. So we have that, but then we also have in the book Miss March, who may still come into the picture yet, to be fair, but she is a spinster, though they never call her that directly, woman living in London. She is from America and is helping these American girls kind of navigate this social world. And she had at one time been engaged to Lord Whittlesey and lives in kind of the memory of this engagement in an almost kind of Miss Havisham adjacent way. So we see these differing points of view and experiences outside of just the society matrons, and it's this reflection of these potential futures in some ways that kind of temper these varied and frenzied kind of expectations. It's this reminder for us as readers or viewers what the world looks like, especially outside of this immediate set. Or even the women in society, like the Duchess, who is more complex in the show in a way that I think I do appreciate. In the book, it's this kind of staid older woman who is stuck in this idea of what being a Duchess is and represents and the protocols, though we do see her toward the end showing signs of these passions she hasn't been allowed through the course of her life to really enjoy, like gardening. And so in the show, seeing her warm to Nan at first and then close herself off when Nan's reputation threatens the reputation of the title makes a little bit more sense, even if it does feel like it's kind of falling into like, oh, Nan's appealing to everyone at first, when I don't know. And I really enjoyed the actress who played Nan. I just didn't really love the love story, love triangle we had going on, even as I recognize that it's this kind of distilled, expedited form of what we're getting in the book, but something in that distilling and expediting has taken away some of the truth of that story in the way that I experienced it. So I don't want to dwell on this forever, and I know I've gone kind of broad strokes with this. I do feel, like I said, that some of the changes in this show, especially like with plot lines with Mabel, really work for me, and others, like Nan's whole illegitimacy plotline, really don't. And I do feel a kind of dramatic irony in being so particular about which text you are using when you are going to change the text this much, which also, like I kind of said or alluded to earlier, makes me wonder if we're being that specific because we are ultimately going to change the ending that Wharton herself mapped out, at least to my understanding. So I don't know. Like I said, I'm not opposed to the material being updated. I'm not opposed to concepts that appeal to new audiences. Now, that being said, what I've read of the BBC version, which I have not seen, also takes some liberties with the text that I wasn't anticipating. So I don't know that we have a definitive version of the Buccaneers. I am going to be very interested to see how conversations around this show continue, if it resonates with specific viewers. And I don't think it's bad, and it clearly has a vision for what it's wanting to explore and to execute. I don't know that it always fully succeeds in that for me, but I definitely think that there is still an audience for this and it is incredibly enjoyable. Anyway, I'm going to stop it there because I don't want to go on too long. There are obviously other changes that we could discuss in detail, but those are kind of my broad impressions of the shape of the thing. I still believe it's worth watching. It doesn't always hit all of the notes for me, but I think it's an interpretation with a clear vision, and I would be very interested to hear what your thoughts on that vision are, especially because this is one of Edith Wharton's lesser read works. So most people are not going to be going into this with the knowledge of the book. And honestly, a lot of people probably aren't going to be going into it with the knowledge of Wharton. I would hazard to say, and those that are going in with a knowledge of Wharton, this probably fits much more with their idea of what Wharton explores. So I don't know. So let me know what you think of both the changes to the text, what you think of the ultimate vision of the show itself, how well it was executed, what you liked, what maybe you didn't. Just let me know what you're thinking. And we won't have any cliffhangers because earlier today after filming, they did announce that the Buccaneers has been picked up for a season 2, so we will get answers to our questions both that the series raised and that we have on how they're going to finagle the plotting from the book, and if they'll finagle the plotting from the book. And because I've been kind of sitting all day feeling a little bit guilty thinking I was too hard on the series, I would like to say that while all of the changes work to varying degrees for me personally as a viewer, I will say that those changes blended together seamlessly into a cohesive season in terms of plotting, playing off of each other, and forwarding everyone's storylines in a way that made sense. And I also do appreciate the fact that we have these complicated young women. Do I think that more of them could have been shown and explored? Yes, but I like that we have these flawed young women that are allowed to be flawed, and they're really just trying to grasp their futures for themselves amidst a flawed system. But thank you, as always, for hanging out and caring about what I think at all. Like and subscribe if you feel like it. It does help me out. Read something good, maybe this book if you're feeling up to it. And yeah, bye.